Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. So when I came here, I didn't know very much about transportation. Now I know quite a bit. And I didn't know very much about the St. Clair neighborhood. Now I know quite a bit. So you might wonder, what the hell am I doing up here? So I can't really add very much to either of those portfolios. And I think the presenters so far have really done a marvelous job of that. But what I do know a fair amount about is relationships. And in particular, employment relationships. And these relationships are undergoing pretty profound changes over the last 20 or 30 years. And I want to sort of speculate a little bit about what those changes might mean if you did meet people walking up down St. Clair. Obviously, they're not coming from Mulock because they can't anymore. But if they were walking up and down St. Clair, what would the relationships that they were engaged in, what would they look like? And then speculate a little bit about what that might mean in the long term. And there we're really going way out on a very slim limb, a long ways out with lots of alligators underneath. So first of all, I just want to start. Oops. So this is the Lewchuck 3 cities map, and was referred to on Friday night. And St. Clair is sort of in this area in here. And so it's sort of in zone 2. So what that really means is that the average income of people in the St. Clair region by the middle of the 2000s was about the same as it was in the 1970s in terms of it was growing about as rapidly as the city on a whole. So it was neither making big leaps forward compared to the rest of the city, nor was it falling behind the rest of the city. It was kind of sharing in the overall prosperity of the city. And again, if you'd walked along St. Clair Avenue 30 or 35 years ago, and you came across someone, you could predict fairly clearly what kind of income they might have. So if it was a white man, they were probably making more. If it was a woman, probably making less. If it was a racialized minority, probably making even less. And if it was a racialized non-white woman, at the very bottom of the income ladder. And that would be in the 70s. If you walk down that street today, you know what? It wouldn't be all that different. White men clearly still making more. Women have closed the gap a little bit, but not enough. And certainly non-white racialized minorities continue to be paid less than everyone else. So from that perspective, things haven't changed all that much. Now, what the Lewchuck data doesn't show, it doesn't show two things. Number one, it's based on average income. And what we know from a lot of research, including my own colleague at McMaster, Mike Gavil, who's really done some great work on the distribution of income in Canada, is that the distribution of income since the 1970s has become increasingly unequal. That those at the top have gotten a lot more money, those at the bottom either have stayed still or, in fact, may have lost ground. I'm not going to speak to that, but I think we can speculate what that means walking along St. Clair when meeting different people. The other thing that the Lewchuck data doesn't tell us very much is about the level of employment security of the people on St. Clair Street. And there have been massive changes, and some of them were sort of foreshadowed by Craig's presentation on the nature of work and what people are actually doing, but that's also changing the employment relationship. And by that, I mean something really quite specific, not so much the work that people do, which is the topic which Craig focused on, but I want to talk about the process by which people find work, keep work, and from time to time renegotiates terms and conditions. And that's very different from what you do once you're inside the factory, once you're inside the workplace. And there we are undergoing a massive change, a significant change in terms of the kinds of the level of security people have, and that's why we now start talking about precarious employment. So again, if we went down St. Clair Street in the 1970s, we met someone. If it was a white man, probably in a secure job, probably unionized, probably near lifetime employment, probably had some benefits, probably had a pension. If it was a woman, not so, not likely at all, probably part-time, contract work, probably without benefits, etc. And if you were a non-white racialized minority in the same kind of boat, probably didn't have access to those kind of jobs. What my research is showing is that if you walk down St. Clair Street today, that picture would be quite different. So the income picture hasn't changed. So who's getting the biggest slice of the pie hasn't changed, but who's getting the most security has changed. And now if you walk down that street and you met a man or a woman, you know what? It'd be very hard to predict the level of employment security of that man or woman. In fact, today more women are in unions than men. And in part, this reflects that what's happened, the decline of manufacturing, the new kind of jobs means that men are much less likely to have that privilege that they had 30 years ago. Certainly, if you come across non-white racialized minorities, racialized minorities, they probably still don't have the kind of security that whites or white women have. So that pattern has changed, and that's precisely what I want to talk about. And in particular, I want to talk about what does that mixing up of employment security mean for families, for households and communities, and the people that perhaps live on the streets coming into St. Clair. And there I suggest there are some real cracks in the kinds of society we built in the 1970s, and we can speculate what that might mean in the future. So let me just... what I'm going to present is based on a study I've been doing with the United Way of Toronto over the last 5 years. We did a survey in late 2011 of 4,000 people in the Toronto-Hamilton labor market, and we asked a series of questions about the nature of their employment relationship, what was going on in their households, and what was going on in their communities. And so some of you may have seen this. This is sort of a picture of what the labor market in the Toronto-Hamilton region looked like in late 2011. And this gold pie here, so this is the pie where those white men in the 1970s would have almost all resided. Permanent jobs, unionized jobs, jobs they expect to have in a year, jobs which have benefits, maybe not complete benefits, but perhaps a pension, perhaps some medical, additional medical insurance, etc. What you can see is that in 2011, only half of our sample, and these are between the ages of 25 and 65, so we've dropped our students from this, who've always been in insecure employment. We've dropped our retirees who are going back and picking up some extra work to supplement an insufficient pension. These are just people 25 to 65. Only half of them told us, I have a full-time job, I expect to have that job in a year, and I get something other than a wage. I get a few benefits, maybe not complete benefits, but a few benefits. The other half are in something else. And that other half are experiencing some level of precarity along different dimensions. We've got our gray pie, it's about 18.4%. These are people who are working through temp agencies, they're on 6-month contracts, their own account self-employed. About just under 10% are permanent part-time. But we know these jobs rarely provide benefits and often have some insecurity. The red pie, I think it's an interesting slice. These are people who, they have full-time jobs, but they couldn't tell us, I expect to have that job in a year. So, there's some uncertainty there. Or they get a wage, but nothing else. There's no pension, there's no supplemental benefits there, and that's kind of a sign that, look, I don't expect to see you here when you're 50 years old. There's some insecurity there. And so what we're trying to understand is, what does all of this mean in terms of families and communities? Now, the other thing that we've sort of argued is that this new way of working, this precarious form of employment, this is no longer just a form of employment that mainly women are occupied in. Certainly that was the case 30 years ago. It's no longer a form of employment that just non-white racialized people are in. It's now spread throughout the various sectors. And so here what we did is we took the 1,000 of our people who we've labeled the most insecure in terms of their employment relationships. They have the most insecurity. So these are our temp workers, our short-term contract workers, etc. And the 1,000 people who are the most secure. Craig and I, tenured professors, who are up there in the secure group, but other people who are in jobs that they expect to have long-term are up there. And what you can see is that when you compare those two groups on a lot of these dimensions, you know what? They don't look all that different. You cannot use sex, color, born in Canada, age, and to some extent whether they have a BA to determine who's in the precarious and who's in that secure group. The precarious are spread across the population more or less the same way that the secure are spread across the population. So when you meet someone on St. Clair, you can't tell how secure their employment is, which part of that pie they're in, simply from looking at their characteristics. What is quite clear is that in some ways there are other differences that are very evident between the precarious group and the secure. The secure group, they're more likely to be in a job that requires a degree, not necessarily more likely having a degree, but more likely to be in a job that requires a degree. But still, about a third of our precarious group are in jobs that require a degree. So this is the sessional appointments at the universities. This is the IT workers working on 6-month contracts, etc. They're just about equally likely to be in the knowledge sector. A little bit more if you're in a secure group, but still quite a few people in the precarious group are in the knowledge sector. This is a big change. Not much difference in the service sector. They're about equally likely. So the old story that precarious employment was people at the mall working in retail is, in fact, I think not all that precise given the changes that have happened over the last 30 years. What is very clear is if you're in the precarious group, you're way more likely to be making less than $40,000. However, for those making 40 to 100, you can still see about 1/3 of our precarious group are making over $40,000. So there is a fair amount of higher paid employment amongst that precarious group. Obviously, it's way better to be in the secure group. There, over 70% are between 40 and 100,000. So but the easy relationship between wages and insecurity is somewhat broken. What is very clear, though, is that if you're in the insecure group, you're not getting any kinds of benefits. You don't have a pension plan. You don't have supplemental health benefits. You don't have a dental plan. You don't have eyeglasses. If your kid gets their teeth knocked out, it's on your tab. It's not on the tab of your benefit plan. Right? And that's a major issue. So the question here is, what does this mean for our households, and what does this mean for our communities? And here I'm going to suggest that the employment relationship, perhaps even more than the kind of work people did, shaped the kind of families we had, shaped the kind of communities we have. So for instance, if you went back, say, 200 or 300 years ago, our attitude towards children, they were a bit of an economic project. They were supplemental sources of income when they were young. We sent them out to work at 8 years old. And they were a retirement plan for mom and dad. Right? So when mom and dad couldn't work anymore, hopefully the kids would kick in and supply some income. As we move forward into the 70s and the 80s, that post-World War II period, children became things we loved, right? Despite themselves. We loved them, right? Going forward, in this new form where employment is less secure, its income is moving up and down, that could change our relationship to children. So one option would be to go back to children as a supplemental source of income. But the other alternative might be, I'm just not going to have kids, right? And that's a kind of rational response, given if your income is going up and down. We all know the demands that the kids make on the budget doesn't go up and down. It's pretty steady and probably rising over time. And so maybe you just don't have kids. And yet again, yesterday we saw the shape of the pyramid, the decline of children on that pyramid. The base is shrinking. That may be just a simple demography effect, but it also may be this reflection of the change in the employment relationship. And certainly we've talked to a lot of young people who said, are you crazy? I would not think of having children given the insecurity I face. And that insecurity can last until you're in your 30s or 40s, by which time that window for having kids is closed. In terms of families and relationships, again, if you go back 100 years, men and women formed relationships there in part as economic necessity, pool income. For women, sometimes for physical protection. It didn't work out all that well in a lot of cases, but that was sort of part of the agenda that was going on. As we get into the 70s and 80s, we begin thinking about those kind of partnerships as really as partnerships and as relationships of attraction. Again, as we're going forward, we could speculate that may change quite dramatically. Maybe relationships become more sequential. You know, if you don't have kids in the horizon, if you don't have steady income, you know, maybe they become more sequential. Or maybe they become more complex. You know, why is it 1 and 2? Maybe 3, 4, 5. And you can imagine a number of ways in which that would solve some of the economic problems that we face. As I said, we're going a long ways out on the limb with lots of alligators underneath. In terms of community, again, the communities of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s that Craig talked about, there was a tremendous cohesion there. And they were often sites of protest and action. You know, today, communities, they're losing some of that. They're places where people sleep and watch TV, perhaps, and they're less likely to form coalitions and political action and protest. And again, going forward, you know, the whole argument, why own a house now when you don't know what your income is going to be, you don't know where you're going to be working with, so the whole nature of neighborhood could become undermined. And it was exactly these kinds of issues that led the United Way to first contact me about 7 years ago to say, look, at what we're seeing is that parts of the Toronto community under duress are also parts of the Toronto community where employment is precarious, it's short-term, it's temporary, and we need to get a better handle on that. So in the few minutes I have left, I just want to sort of present some of the data we have, which shows where those cracks really are showing up, and to sort of encourage you to think that employment insecurity is a massively important variable in determining these kinds of social outcomes. Okay, so this is a bit of a complex picture, but let me sort of explain what I've done here. And I'm going to start by making soup. So imagine I start with some chicken stock. It's very good chicken stock. Even has a few chicken feet in it to give it a little extra flavor. So I start with that stock, and then I add some carrots, and I add some celery, and I add some dill, and maybe I add some chilies and stuff like that. And I cook it up, and I say, wow, I think I have a much better soup. But I now have a magical machine that allows me to disassemble that whole process and go back to my chicken stock. So I can take out all the flavor that the carrots gave. I can take out all the flavor that the celery gave. I can take out all the flavor that the dill gave. And then I can use my little machine to say, how much did the carrots make my soup taste better or worse? And how much did the celery make my soup taste better or worse? And then what about the dill? And what about the chilies, right? So I can disassemble it to see whether my soup is better or worse. That'd be a fantastic machine if we had that in our kitchens. Well, here, what we start with, instead of chicken stock, we're going to start with a white male making less than $40,000 in insecure employment. That's what we're going to start with. And then we start adding things here. So the first column, we take that insecure person and we give him a secure job. So we add some security into his soup. And the next few columns, we give him a little bit more income. So rather than having an income of $35,000, we'll move him into the 40 to 50, 50,000, 60 to 70, 80 to 90, 100,000, the jackpot, right? So we give him the person a little bit more income. And over here, our male has a sex change and becomes a female. And so what impact does that have on what's going on? And here we change the ethnicity of the person, Chinese, South Asian, black, and other racialized. And what we're measuring here is rather than the taste of the soup, what these changes have on child welfare. And we're measuring child welfare by the ability of households to buy school supplies, pay for school trips, pay for other kinds of activities, send your kid to camp, volunteer at school meetings, volunteer on your kid's hockey team or ball team or any other Girl Guides or whatever else you want to volunteer. All things that we could, I think, reasonably argue would make children better off. Lines that go above zero mean that child welfare is better. Lines that go below means that child welfare is worse. And so what you can see is after you've done all these changes, and again, we've isolated here just the impact of employment insecurity, shifting that person from insecure where they started, down in precarious employment to secure employment, leads to a positive outcome for child welfare. Income, so if we lower the income from the 30s down to the below 20, that has a bit of a negative effect, but it's hard to figure out. The yellow things mean it's not really statistically significant. we can keep increasing the income. Moving this person into the $40,000 to $50,000 range has about the same impact as moving this person from insecure to secure employment. And as we add more income, well, the kids are better off. They go to camp more often, they pay for more school trips, better backpacks, and better supplies, etc. Gender, insignificant. Being Chinese, insignificant. But there are some fairly significant negative factors here for being South Asian, black, or other racialized individuals. This is a simple measure of discrimination in our society. That's really what this is saying. It's saying all other things equal, if you are South Asian, or if you're black, or if you're from other racialized minorities, you're doing worse, and it's just a simple measure of discrimination. If we move now to household well-being, so what's going on in your household? So here now the soup that we're starting with, or the taste of the soup, is about making ends meet at home, buying the things you need, paying for food, low anxiety at home because of the insecurity you have because of your employment relationship, right? You're saying, okay, I'm just anxious, I don't know if I'm going to have a job next week, etc. And ability to fill household tasks. Here we see the impact of insecurity is even more dramatic, right? Here is a very large impact, and it's larger than any of our increases in income. So in terms of household well-being, the level of insecurity is probably the dominant variable in terms of determining how well these folks behave. Way more important than income. And the last slide here is socializing. So this is the ability of people to have friends. So here we're talking about belonging to your community, having a friend to talk to, a friend to help with small jobs, someone to have a meal with, work schedule prevention, doing things with friends. Again, what we can see is moving this person from precarious employment to secure employment has a massive positive effect on your ability to socialize, to engage in your community. And again, we see income having eventually some effect. And again, we see this problem of discrimination in our society. It's real, and it's reflected in this data. So to wrap up, what does all of this mean in terms of conclusions? One is that the characteristics of those in precarious employment is in many ways not as different today as it was 30 years ago compared to those in secure employment. 30 years ago, we could predict fairly clearly who was in and who wasn't in secure employment. Today, it's more difficult to do that. What is clear is if you are in this precarious employment group, and all the evidence is that's growing, that's the new form of employment, they are making significantly less. They're not getting the kind of benefits one needs to sustain households, to sustain communities. And the final point is, if this form of employment becomes the norm without us doing anything, I would suggest that our households face major crises. How we participate in communities is going to become more difficult. And if we want to talk about a disaster on St. Clair Street, that will be the disaster if we don't do anything, not building the streetcar. I'll stop there.